This episode of Back to the Roots podcast is brought to you by Byron Seeds. The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds. You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. This is Brian Wood, and today, along with Mike Klein, we're in Clermont, Florida with Uncle Matt's Organic, and we're sitting down with Ben McLean, who is the head of research, and Benny McLean, who is the head of production, and really appreciate you guys being on. We want to take a little time to hear some of the background of starting your groves, getting into organic, and just some of the agronomical stuff on the citrus side. But before we get into that, you guys just want to give a quick introduction of yourselves. And Ben, you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. So Ben McLean III, and have the pleasure of working with my dad. And I've been a part owner and also head of research with Uncle Matt's Organic. I've been doing that since the early 2000s. And I work with our certifier and putting our farm plan together as well. What I'm tasked with a lot is trying to obviously enhance production, solve some of our pressing issues like citrus greening disease or citrus canker, and then communicate some of those solutions to the other people in our farm plan that may be associated growers.
Mm-hmm. Well, appreciate it, and we're going to get more into the agronomic side in a little bit. But Benny, you want to give a little bit of an introduction and some of the background of how the family got into citrus?
Benny McLean, and I graduated from UF in 1965 with a degree in ag economics with a minor in citrus, and grew up in the citrus industry with my dad. I was born and raised in Bartow, moved up to Clermont when I was 12 years old. Prior to that, my dad actually set up the Florida Southern College ag school so you could get a degree in citrus, and he taught down there for a couple of years, and then he handed it off to a good friend and got back into production, and that's when we moved up there to Clermont. And my dad was production manager for a company here called Polo Groves, and as I was growing up, my dad would let me work in the summertime in the groves, nothing big time, just, working on a hand crew, pulling vines, removing dead limbs and stuff like that. But you worked in the summertime doing that, and, you became acclimated, if that's the right word. You became accustomed to the rain, the cold, the heat, the gnats, the sand, the bees, all that was out in the grove. And of course, when I grew up, we didn't even have air conditioning. The cars didn't even have air conditioning. So you work all day in the grove, like on a Saturday, and you go home, and the house wasn't air conditioned. You didn't know any different. Now today, as you well know, it's totally different working in a grove all day. And now you have a home that's air conditioned, you have a car that's air conditioned. But it was really a tremendous opportunity for me as a young man to work with my dad in the citrus business and learn the value of hard work. And it was expected out of me working with my dad. I'm the oldest of 5 boys, and everybody grew up in the citrus, working in the weekends and firing groves during the wintertime with freezes and et cetera. But I had the opportunity to work with my dad and learn a lot about what we call observation. And if you're going to be successful and just pick a crop, any type of ag, you could go interview any of these growers, and they've all got a ability to observe and, what's going on with this tree or this vine or this plant or, so you make observations. That's how you learn. And so to fast forward to the business of my dad and I owned acreage throughout Central Florida. I say Central Florida, up here in the Clermont area. And it was an idea that you could buy it for X number of dollars an acre, and you knew on average it would produce, let's say, $600 boxes per acre, and you could sell them for $2 to $3 a box. So that'd give you, $1,200 to $1,500 an acre, and you could do caretaking for $300 or $400 an acre. So you learn the economics, okay, of we use the old saying, buy low, sell high. That's how you become successful. And so now you could sit down and do a budget, and you knew what it cost to irrigate, you knew what it cost to fertilize, and you pretty much had a good idea of what the value of the fruit was going to be, even though it's blooming now and you're not going to pick it for 9 or 10 months. You had a pretty good idea of what the value of the crop was. And we learned that you now had equity in a grove. Let's say, for example, you bought it for $1,500 an acre, and you knew how much it cost to take care of the thing, and the value of that property with that grove, with that crop, may be $4,000 an acre, and you only had $1,500 an acre in it. So you had equity that you could go to a bank, and they would appraise the grove, let's say at $4,000 an acre, and you only owed $2,000 an acre on it. So you had $2,000 an acre equity, where in the citrus industry you could go to just about any type of lending institutions and you could borrow money based on the equity in that grove. So that was the whole game that you played. So now first grove I bought, 10 acres, bought it for $1,500 an acre, and in 2 years it was valued at $3 or $3,000 an acre, and I got $1,000 an acre crop out of it. So now I took that money and went and found another 10 acres, and I ended up over a period of time with 350 acres scattered all around Lake County, and my dad had about 200 acres. And I like to tell the story that about 6 months prior to the 1983 freeze, I found a grove that joined up on top of Sugarloaf where I lived. I wanted to buy a 20-acre grove there. So I went to the bank, and the banker said, well, we got to appraise all your groves and see what it is. So it came back that the acreage at that time was appraised at $7,000 an acre, okay? I owed $4,000 an acre across the board, an average, all right? So you can do the math real quick. I had $1 million equity, okay? So back then, that was no problem. You put that up, you went and bought another grove, and you worked it all out, and you just kept expanding like that. Well, that was 6 months before the 83 freeze. Okay, 1 month after the 83 freeze, okay, all the trees are dead. You have no income coming, all right, and now the grove is valued at $1,000 an acre, all right, and I have a $3,000 obligation that I owe. I now owe $1 million overnight. Just boop, went from $1 million equity to $1 million liability. So my whole life started then about, oh wow, how do you survive now where everything's dead? And if you said, oh well, I'll replant, well, it's 4 or 5 years before it would even produce another crop. And so you're really in the citrus business, you're up against a wall that you never encountered. You never studied at UF. You didn't have any friends that ever had anything like that to deal with.
So just to back up a little bit to the 83 freeze, was that the first big freeze that came through this area?
No, it was not the first big freeze. We had a freeze in 1962 that was very similar, where it was a blowing cold. Okay, so if you're in the citrus industry, the whole idea is not to have any wind if you're going to have any type of cold protection, whether it's a wind machine, microjet irrigation, or a grove heater. If the wind's blowing, it blows all of the heat out from under the canopy of the tree, all right? And under that canopy is the same temperature as out in the wide middle. All right, the whole idea of cold protection, the microjet irrigation, what it does, it's producing water, and when a liquid freezes, it releases heat. Not heat that you and I can walk up there and say it's like a fire, but it's heat that's captured under that canopy. Okay, that was the same what the wind machine did. The wind machine pulled air out of the upper atmosphere that was about 100 feet above the grove, which, as you understand, in a cold night, the higher you go, the warmer the temperature. Cold air is heavy, it settles. So the wind machine pulls the warm air out, mixes it with the cold air, so the temperature goes up. And the wind machine makes a 360-degree circle every 15 minutes, all right? So what happens with that, if the wind's blowing at 100 feet, it's 18 degrees, and on the ground it's 18 degrees. So the wind machine doesn't work. The grove heater's the same thing. The heat is collected there around that heater, and now that wind's blowing and it blows it all out. So every method that the grower had to protect the grove didn't work. They were useless because of the wind. It was like a 25-mile-an-hour wind, and it did it for 3 days. 62 freeze was the same thing, but it did not kill as many acres of citrus in 1962 like it did in 1989. And the reason being is that there were a lot more acres planted from the 62 freeze to the 83 freeze. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot more younger trees. And you know, the older the tree, the more hardy it is as far as a blowing freeze. A young tree, you know, you've got small wood, what we call juvenile wood, and it nails that in a heartbeat.
And when you talk freeze, like in Ohio, if we get a freeze, it means, okay, the tree was blooming and it froze. It doesn't kill the tree. It kills that year's crop. But it's still, the tree will be fine. Your freezes here in the citrus world literally kills the tree dead just like you would have cut it down.
Yeah,
right?
With those kind of conditions that we had in the 83, 85, 89 freeze. Yeah, and they all came in December and January when the tree is completely dormant. We don't bloom in the citrus industry until February, March. Okay, they break dormancy and start blooming then. So these trees, this was the dead of winter when they came. And we had 60-year-old trees, you know, trunks. You couldn't even put your hands around them. It killed them. I mean, dead. Wow. It was hard to believe. It was unreal of how Central Florida literally got wiped out.
And what percentage of those grows were, well, probably after 83, some of them were replanted. Then they got hit again in 85. Then some replanted back in 89, then hit again. After the third freeze, what percentage of the grows were ever replanted?
Well, to give you a perfect example, this area up here where we are situated right now was called Central Florida Citrus Ridge, and we had 300,000 acres of bearing citrus up here prior to the 83 freeze. Okay, December 83 hits us, and now 13 months later, we have another freeze, the same wind speed, the same air temperatures, and whatever survived the 83 freeze, which was not many, they had all been buckhorned and pruned, and now these 50, 60-year-old trees that survived were now full of juvenile wood. So 13 months later, we get hit again. Now that completely, anything that survived the 83 freeze was now killed. All right, so in 13 months, we lost 300,000 acres of bearing citrus. Now, 4 years later, 1989, we get hit again with the same speed, same temperatures, and there were about 40 to 50,000 acres here in Central Florida had been replanted in those 3 or 4 years, obviously by growers that had other assets and they were able to, borrow money, etc. And they had planted back. Now that tree was only 3 to 4 years old, and the only way you could save that tree was you dig it up and take it in your house because it's just a juvenile tree. There's nothing you could do to protect it, and it wiped that out. So after the 89 freeze, that's when, okay, we're done with citrus up here. Now, right now today, according to the county agent, there's less than 5,000 acres up here in this area now today, and it's all infected with greening.
The citrus world intrigues me because it's a part of agriculture that I know absolutely nothing about. So thinking of having a freeze kill, of completely wiping out a crop that takes 3 or 4 or 5 years after you plant it to actually start harvesting, like that'll put you out of business right quick.
In a heartbeat, yeah. And I wasn't the only one, obviously, that got affected, with the liability and equity. Just about the majority of the people in the citrus industry in Central Florida, that's the way they worked. You built up equity in your property and you borrowed money based on the equity, and that's how you got another grove. You kept working your way through that, and I think they do the same thing in the cattle business. They do, you go down any part of agriculture, it's all about equity, that you can borrow money off of the value of what you're growing.
So now today, there's obviously still Florida citrus growing, but it's moved out of this area quite a bit. Has it just moved south, and just to avoid weather? Is it still as prominent, or is it just going?
Well, it's definitely, as you move further south, it's warmer, okay? They still, 3, 4 counties down south of us in the 83, 85, 89 freeze, they got damage. But it did not completely kill the tree. It damaged them, but they were able to prune them and bring them back. Mm-hmm. But up here, it was so cold up here that it literally killed 50, 60-year-old trees. And now today, the value of this land up here is so high based on the expansion of homes that you cannot afford to go out there and buy a 40-acre grove, a 40-acre piece of land, and plant it with the idea that it will not produce any fruit that you can harvest for 4 or 5 years. You can't. The math doesn't work. It's just so the people that are still in the citrus business, they figured that out too, and the majority of them moved south.
Sure. Sure. So I do want to go into, so you got your groves after 89, you did replant some at that point?
Yes, we did. When Matt got involved and started out with the Uncle Matt's organic idea, I took where I live on what we call Sugarloaf Mountain, the second highest point in the state of Florida. I planted out about 6 or 7 acres with the idea that it was going to be a U-pick. Okay, and so we got it certified organic. We planted it, and the whole theory was that it was going to be a U-pick that we could go to all of these schools and universities and stuff around. They could do tours, see what a certified organic grove looked like, and they could even pick the fruit, taste the fruit. And of course, Ben does a lot of research up there, so it was an opportunity not only to have a certified organic you pick it, but you also had ongoing research, organic research, that was all valuable. Now, obviously, when I did it, we didn't have greening, so everything that we planted just took right off, and was very successful, and it filled the need of what we had to do farm tours. And a lot of the tours that came, well, we had chefs that came out from Disney, they wanted to see organic grapefruit, organic navels, organic tangerines, things like that we really appealed to a lot of the small schools, even the high schools that had ag courses, or ag classes. We opened it up for them that they could come out and look at it, and in fact, we just did a tour a couple of days ago from Valencia College over here. They brought a class out, about 30 students, and they usually do it once a year. They come out, and Ben gives them all the update on what the research is showing and what the production, and so it's been very useful, and we still do it. We're looking forward to it.
So as far as getting into that organic and starting that, was that something that was familiar with you, those practices, like going back to when you first started, or did you have to you had a whole new learning curve?
No, it was a whole new learning experience for me, because I had been conventional up until that time. And as Matt mentioned briefly in his story that he was telling about, when he came back with the idea, we rallied up the whole family. My dad was sitting there with us, and Matt said, "Man, there's a great opportunity for organic juice exporting. There's a big demand for it." And he asked my dad Pappy, we called him Pappy. "Pappy, can we grow organic citrus up here on the ridge?" And my dad kind of looked at Matt, and he kind of bowed up and said, "Matt, what the hell do you think we did for the last 100 years? Nobody told us it was organic." So, that's kind of been a joke with the family even today. We laugh about that. And so I had to learn everything I could about growing organic. And thank goodness I had a son like Ben that he understood the chemistry, physics, and biology of the soil, and we started working together and doing research, and started seeing, oh yeah, my dad was right. My God, we've been using this product all this time, and for example, it's a bactericide, and we're trying to grow bacteria in the grove, in the soil, to help with turning on the immune system of that tree, So why are we using a bactericide, And no different than a miticide, There's certain mites that are friendlies in here in the organic arena, and why are you using a miticide and killing all the mites and killing all the spiders, and just go down the list, Mm-hmm. So it became more and more where you were like, wow, my dad was right, we've been doing all this thing wrong. We're chasing the wrong rainbows. And so by getting into that organic arena, now you went around and you looked at other groves and other locations and different soil chemistries and different grow practices, and you started seeing, wow, there's something to this. We saw, a lot of disease pressure just start going down from conventional to getting to the organic, our goals of where we wanted to be. And even today, now, do we have greening? Yes, we have greening, no different than our neighbors. However, we don't have the fruit drop, and we don't have the leaf drop like the conventional boys do. And when you test our fruit, when you get the juice and send it to a lab, compared to the conventional, okay, we have a lot more of what's needed in that juice than what our conventional boys do. And we give being organic all that credit.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing that you don't have a handle on yet is the greening. Like all the other stuff in the organic operation, you haven't really, did you have big snags along the way in figuring that out?
Yeah, it's been, the whole thing has been trial and error. Okay, because there's nothing written. You know, you can't get a book and turn to, you know, here's what you need to do. It's all been trial and error where, you know, Ben has put out numerous trials over the last years that we've been certified organic. There's so many different rootstocks. There's so much different budwood. There's so much different soil chemistry that all these things have an effect. You just got to figure out, you know, this complements this turns this on, you know, and you just continue to work. And we only get one crop a year. And that's what we're basing everything on is what is the quality of the juice. Like you heard Matt say earlier, you know, it's got to have the color, it's got to have the bricks, it's got to have the acid, it's got to have the right ratio to have a super product. So that's our goal in the organic thing.
Well, it's a system. You know, that's what we talked to all different types of growers, whether it's corn, hay, citrus.
It's the same
matter.
game.
It's the same. It's all about getting that biology active so that it can benefit you rather than hurt you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be more complicated than that, even though, as I'm sure, Ben, you've seen, is you can get more complicated than that and dive more down into the details, which I'd love to hear a little bit more on.
Yeah, so, you know, as I think Dad was saying, on the trial and error, you know, there was a big adjustment going forward. How do you supply nutrients to plants in a biological system? And one of the challenges was converting existing groves that were under a conventional management program, which had lost most of the organic matter that was native to the soil and may have been there decades ago. And a lot of the conventional groves that we encountered, they would have excessive levels of phosphate and excessive levels of copper that were based on decades back of our conventional farming. And then, you know, the use of a lot of synthetic herbicides or fertilizers would also basically change the biology of the soil that you needed to go into an organic and regenerative type of system. So that was one of our challenges in the conversion practice. What did we do, you know? And, you know, looking back on it, like Dad and I said, I think we would have liked to have been more aggressive in cover cropping from the day we began a conversion of an existing conventional grove, and perhaps been more aggressive in adding compost or something like that at high rates at the very beginning so that we could reestablish that, you know, or perhaps for the first time establish a biological population that we needed to help us mobilize and mineralize the nutrients, because everything that you put on in organic is from a natural source. So when we used materials like feather meal, for example, or peanut meal to supply primarily our nitrogen, it's now much more slow release than we're accustomed to. It's biologically mediated, as I said, and you're not used to those release curves, if you will. You know, you're used to putting out something that's immediately soluble and available, whether it's ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate or things like that you used conventionally. So we did learn, as Dad said, though, to, you know, apply further back from the windows of when you needed. You know, we learned to address some of the weed issues with some better forms of mechanical cultivation. We learned to grow which we're doing now, learn to grow our weeds up and let them go to seed, some of the grasses and others, and found that they were actually pretty rich in nitrogen, and then cut them into the soil.
So I want to step back. You mentioned cover crops.
Yes.
How does a cover crop work? Because when I think of cover crops, I'm thinking you take the corn off and then you put a rye or something in as a cover crop so the soil's never bare. Is your cover crop, you're putting that in existing groves?
Yes, that's correct. And so one of the challenges is when you have perennial tree crops like ours, you can't cover crop like, say, you learn up at Rodale Institute where, you know, Jeff Moyer has such a great demonstration site there. And like you said, he you know, harvests the corn and then he tills in hairy vetch and then it overwinters and then he, you know, knocks down the hairy vetch and then he tills the corn back into that and it comes up. Well, in tree crops, we don't have that luxury because, you know, it's perennial and there's only so much shade in that middle where we drive down. And so you have to find a way during the rainy season, or during an appropriate time that equipment is not in and out of the grove heavy amounts like during harvest, that you could just seed, for example, right down the middles. And so sometimes we would put in legumes. We put in things like hairy indigo. We've put in cowpeas and others, and we've seen that work and raise the manganese level availability like Don Huber talks about, while also supplying extra slow release nitrogen. We've put in clovers and others. It's an area that we're going to try to continue to learn and develop. But one thing we found out was that actually some of the grasses that were growing up, just like our guinea grass and others, when we did a feed forage analysis on it, we found that this is suitable for cattle feed. And it's pretty high in nitrogen itself too. And so when we began to let it grow up and then just chop it down, roll it or crimp it down, that was breaking down and acting just like a leguminous cover crop as well. And we began to find that this just diverse mixture of weeds and these grasses would grow up in our middles as well too. And they were acting in a way that was encouraging that biodiversity, just like you would have thought planting simply a legume. One of the things we've got to learn in citrus too is how do we perhaps bring some multi-species cover cropping into these middles.
Now, when you say middles, are you just in between the rows of trees, or
yes,
are you spreading it underneath the tree?
Well, you can't spread it underneath the tree really, because that's heavily shaded, and so essentially you get little, if any, growth of your cover crops underneath the tree canopy in the shade. I mean, one thing you find is that shade is an excellent natural herbicide. And that if you grow a good tree crop with a lot of shade, you don't get a lot of weed pressure. One of the challenges we had, as Dad said, in converting is that in the old system, like from the 1970s on back, the irrigation was overhead often. Either sprinklers installed in the ground, with big rainbirds, or what we would call walking guns, just self-propelled guns that, spray several acres at a time. And so the entire orchard floor would get wet. So then if you grew a cover crop, a leguminous cover crop or something in the drive middle, we call the row middle where the trees are planted, and then they come out, and then we hedge that so that our equipment can get in between the trees. So we call that the middle or the drive middle. And that can become a source of compaction in the sand, places like that give you trouble. However, you have to work the groves. Well, we used to have overhead irrigation, as I said, that would wet the entire floor. So if you planted a hairy indigo leguminous cover crop, for example, in that middle, then that orchard floor would get wet, and so that cover crop would germinate and do fine in the spring. But when we switched to micro sprinkler under tree irrigation, as Dad mentioned earlier, from the 80s forward, that only sprays underneath the tree canopy. It doesn't wet out into the middle where your weeds or your cover crops would be growing. So one of our challenges too was during these dry periods, which Florida is often dry, mid-March to late May, you can't get your cover crop to grow up very well out in the middle, as it's just too dry. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in the fall, it can get pretty dry in Florida, early October to early December as well too. So the challenges of adapting, from conventional to organic in a biological system, they're many and varied.
And I assume, and I'd like to ask that, I assume when you're doing a transition, you said you want to be a little bit, or you realize that you maybe should have been more aggressive. I know in talking to farmers about transitioning to organic, their fear is always that there's going to be that drop in production that's going to happen when you're in that transition. And I assume you had the same conversations in talking to farmers, but how do you navigate through that?
We had the same conversations and challenges, and early on we encountered those same yield drops because, like I said earlier, the orchards, the citrus groves were not set up to farm biologically. And so to just switch your sources over to things like a feather meal or a pelletized manure, organically approved, it doesn't release. The grove doesn't respond like you need it to. So some of the things we had to do in those transition processes is, make your last conventional application of fertilizer heavier and make your first applications of organic fertilizer heavier than you would think. And then, go ahead and tell yourself, okay, I've got to give extra TLC to this soil. I've got to inoculate it with either biological products, compost teas, and perhaps, if I can afford it, multi-species cover cropping, because you have to take that into consideration. If you're farming a tired, exhausted, soil that's microbially deficient, that's lost so much of its organic matter, and as I said, that we were dealing with residual high levels of phosphorus and copper, from 50 to 80 years prior of that conventional farming that Dad and I and others did, then you realize that, boy, your challenges were even higher than if you had just started fresh. Mm-hmm. So I think you just have to take it into account, and you have to know that conversion process is going to be a challenge, and it's a barrier to entry. Mm-hmm. And looking back on it, I wish that we had just simply budgeted more financial resources to feed the crop and feed the soil the first 6 to 12 months right out of the gate, and then said to either our partners or our potential farmer that was coming into our farm plan, because we had associated growers that we would just lease their land, or we had other growers that would farm alongside us and we would buy their crop organic and we would just consult for them. We had a variety of agreements and arrangements. But to present that cost up front, okay, here's the conversion cost as best as we see it. And if you're not willing to bear that, you probably shouldn't get into this, because there is going to be a lot of pain down the way 18 months from now if you haven't addressed those limiting factors.
Well, and I know that we see a lot in transitioning farms that one of the driving factors in transitioning is economic. And usually that farm is struggling prior to looking at organic. And
Yes.
Organic is, they're looking at it as bigger price.
Yes.
We need that. But, being able to go to them and say, no.
Right.
You got to have the money here to get through this, or you're not going to
Yes.
get to the profitable side.
Well said. And I wish that we could somehow get a price premium for transitional organic. It doesn't exist in the marketplace, to my knowledge, that we saw, because that can be a challenge. People want to get that better price. Some of them want to adopt these better practices, but that 3-year conversion period, you can't have a yield dip, and yet you're getting the same conventional price. And so it's actually, for some, it can be more painful. Mm-hmm. And that's unfortunate, because, we want to see more and more acres converted over to organic or sustainable regenerative
It would
farming.
be nice if there was not like a non-GMO, but a pesticide-free or some,
Yes.
like a gap label before you're certified to give that. And we have the same thing in pretty much all of ag. Mm-hmm. If there was somehow, for people that are transitioning, just give it a little bump in price to offset the higher inputs cost for those 3 years.
I agree.
It would make transitioning so much easier, and people would be more likely to do it, I think.
Well, and at the same
Yes.
time, it keeps the market steady.
It does.
It keeps
Right.
it from being oversupplied. Like you said, there is that barrier to entry, and in some ways, that's not the worst thing in the world. It keeps
Yep.
people that are serious from going, that they're the ones that are going to go through.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Now, you're head of research.
Yes.
So, and I'm guessing greening probably threw that into overdrive.
Yes.
But what are you mostly working on with your research? Do you do your own plant breeding?
We do not. We would rely on the University of Florida and the United States Department of Agriculture to supply us with our new cultivars. And they have a really robust program that's traditional breeding, Mendelian genetics, it's non-GMO, and it has fortunately supplied the Florida citrus industry with several tolerant, perhaps even resistant rootstocks, and several tolerant, not totally resistant, but tolerant scion varieties that we see are good combinations that when we put with enhanced nutrition programs give us a lot of optimism that we can now grow through this greening problem. My work has mostly been concerned with greening because it's such a cumulative problem, and it immediately became the limiting factor because it causes premature fruit drop. It causes reduction in internal quality of the fruit. In layman's terms, the fruit will become small and sour that is symptomatic with greening. And sometimes you can have a third of the fruit that's on the tree is pretty much symptomatic from this greening disease. It's off color, it's small, it's misshapen, it's off flavor or taste. And then when all of that is harvested and put together in one box, then it lowers the quality of that box, whether it's sent to juice extraction or whether it's packed out for fresh fruit consumption, because some of the symptomatic fruit will still go through a USDA number 1 grade. Most of it will get culled out, but that occasional one in there still can throw off a 4-pound bag or a 2-fist carton, and all it takes, unfortunately, is one off-flavor, misshapen fruit to come through in a fresh fruit setting to turn off a consumer, for the long period. So that very real yield quality reduction became forefront for us to have to address. And so that's, why I had to make it my priority within Uncle Matt's. It was forced on us. Along the way, we're always trying to study what are our nitrogen sources and what are our weed control options. In general, that's the two biggest things that I see that limit organic citrus production, is that it costs a lot to buy feather meal or other materials like that. And, so you still, when you get a fully grown citrus tree, you have to give a pretty good amount of plant food to get good production. And yet those materials can be pretty expensive. So we were commonly spending, a third, maybe even a half more on our plant food budget back when our groves were really in full production versus if we had been doing it conventionally and using synthetics. The synthetic fertilizer market is obviously huge, and there's a lot of competition, and there's tremendous supply and supply chain through it. So it's you can get some pretty good prices out there at times too for the material. It's highly competitive. Whereas the organic nutritional market for feather meal or cottonseed meal or the things you can use is much, much, much smaller. So, you tend to then pay higher prices. I also, have tried on and off to spend a lot of time on weed control. What can we do? And we try not to think in a conventional mindset, that we have to kill or eradicate. We try to manage. We try to use the weeds as our friends and lightly chop them in, lightly till them in, so that we know that they extract nutrients from the soil as well. We know that they harvest sunlight and exude sugars through their roots, and we know that they're part of the biodiversity that we want. And so we're actually learning, Dad and I, more to let them cycle up, kind of complete their life cycle, go to seed head, and then not necessarily mow and shred them down, but more like chop them and roll them. We couldn't do the roller crimper program like they have up at Rodale because our weeds just grow too fast here with the rain and the sunshine. And when we found that we would crimp them, it wouldn't kill them. It might bust the top or lay them flat, but they would just sprout right back up quickly, unlike what's been able to be done in some of the much northern cold climates. But we've got some choppers, rotary choppers, old school, that we use with some dull blades, and they're almost like a roller crimper. They're kind of a combo. And so we've got some groves around, with our small acreage that's left. We're just chopping in a real robust weed crop and putting out some compost and compost tea sprays is giving us adequate nitrogen. And we're excited about, what we're learning and seeing there. I think what's important too, when you look back on it, is that in Florida, because of the humid subtropic climate, the crop plants, the weeds, all of it can grow quite vigorously, sometimes year round. We can get 80-something degrees in the Florida winter. And so it is a challenge because, a young cucurbit transplant can be choked down by weeds real easy, right? And a young citrus tree can be quickly choked down by, grasses and others. And so we're really trying to find the happy medium there between, yes, the weeds are our friends and we want to let them grow and turn them into the soil and let them release nutrients and promote biodiversity, but at least get them away from the trunk or the plant enough so that the crop plant can also grow and thrive, and we can be profitable in that regard.
You would be talking about a young tree.
I would, yes.
Before he's got the canopy to shade out the weeds.
Absolutely. And so that's your challenge. It takes you 3 or 4 years or more to get a good canopy to shade out the weeds. And so we've been working and experimenting with putting down just ground cloth, nursery ground cloth, as a shade, as a weed mat, if you will, and then, planting the young trees into that and growing that for 3 or 4 years. And of course you can use approved, plastic mulches and others in your organic vegetable production, and we did a little bit of that along the way too. You have to remove that each year out of your field and all. But there's going to have to be something learned long term, because we even worked with wood mulches and pine barks, and some of that works, but there's got to be some kind of ability to suppress the weeds, at least in the early stages of the growth, so that the plant, the tree, can get a head up and get its roots established and then get going. Mm-hmm. Because the proverbial grows like a weed really applies in Florida when it's hot and raining.
Because with your compost and stuff that you're putting on, it's not just the tree that likes that. The weeds love that too.
They do. The weeds love it. And the weeds love all of that we put on.
Mm-hmm. So what are there new varieties coming out, not just for the greening, but that you feel like the fruit quality is better and better?
I do. And one, for example, is Sugar Bell. It's been released by the University of Florida, developed by Dr. Fred Gmitter, Dr. Jude Grosser. And it has shown some pretty good tolerance to citrus screening. It was actually released over 10 years ago. And just through their analysis of it, it's shown to have good fruit quality and good yields during this problem. And so that's something that growers are planting back. There's some other varieties of Valencia oranges. One's called the Ori Lee. There's some other selections that have come out of Brazil where there's been a lot of pressure with greening, Vernia, Valkyrius, other varieties like that are, again, showing some promise, along with our rootstocks that are developed by the USDA lab in Fort Pierce and University of Florida as well in Fort Pierce and Lake Alfred, that are mixtures of our rootstocks, Cleopatra mandarin and sour orange and trifoliate, our historic choices that we've used. And they have found some pretty good traditional breeding crosses that are showing, again, some tolerance to the disease. So if we put, for example, a Vernia on 897, which is a mixture of these, old rootstocks, then that's showing us promise. Mm-hmm. The various rootstocks out there, they have numbers 897 and 942 and others, as are generally, USDA numbers. And we see that if you use good nutrition, particularly micronutrient nutrition, zinc, manganese, and boron are the most important of the micronutrients for citrus screening disease. And then you select these tolerant rootstocks and tolerant scions, which are showing good internal quality, that it can be done. Mm-hmm. It can be done.
When you say rootstocks, that is the rootstock, then you graft the variety onto that rootstock?
That's correct. Yeah, okay. Citrus, some people don't realize, but citrus has what's called a juvenility period. So if you buy an orange at your local grocery store and you take a seed out of that orange and plant it in the ground, it will make an orange tree. However, it will be 7 to 13 years before it flowers and makes fruit. And it could be on the long end of that. So commercially, that's not viable for us to be profitable. And also, seedlings tend to be real thorny, so they're commercially difficult to harvest. They tend to grow upright and straight and tall, so that's can be commercially difficult to harvest. So gosh, I don't know, probably over 100 years ago, the citrus industry began grafting. And so we would take true species varieties like Cleopatra mandarins or sour oranges that didn't make a commercially viable fruit for us to eat, but it's still in the citrus genus, and it's very hardy and very robust, and we would graft mature budwood from a desired fruiting variety onto that rootstock. And then that would help you get into production in year 3 or year 4, and then grow a tree that, again, is not real thorny and not, as tall and
the
slender.
same thing as in the apple industry.
Yes.
They do the same grafting, because if you actually plant apple seeds from an apple, whatever variety it is, it's not going to grow that apple.
That's right.
It grows, the seedlings are same as the rootstock, right? On an apple, I think.
I'm not real familiar with it, but I know your point is well taken, that there's a lot of varieties that are not true to type in their seeds. If the flower was cross-pollinated, then the seed that you plant may not come out exactly like the fruit that you ate, whether it's citrus, apples, even peaches. And so that's the other thing that comes into the standardization of the industry. If you use the budwood, then you are guaranteed that it's true to type of the genetics, rather than, again, planting all the seeds and hoping for them to come up.
So as far as varieties, it sounds like most of the work is being done on greening resistance or tolerance. What about flavors, or can you talk a little bit about how you test for? You talked about bricks and acid and stuff along those lines. What you're looking for?
Yeah. So even though greening takes up a lot of my time, it overlaps with my other passion and love that I share with my dad and my brother, which is nutrient density. And that's one of the things that I've loved over the decades of going to the Acres USA conferences, listening to John Kemp's wonderful podcasts. We hired Arden Anderson as a consultant here for Uncle Matt's for years, and I love using him as a consultant, reading his books as well. That within the organic, sustainable, regenerative crowd, there's this undergirding, overarching passion for nutrient density. That what we grow and we're going to pass on down the line, and it's going to help other people, it's going to bless them, it's going to feed them, and that we feel that responsibility as the producer, that we want to make this as healthy as we can with the least amount of pesticide residues and the highest amount of nutritional content and quality. So that's something that I've made a lot of my time focused on that as well. And so how do we do that? Several ways. We take regular juice samples out in our groves. We look at the loads when they come through, the bricks, the acid, like Dad said, and try to then go back and look at your production plan or your variety or your location or your rainfall. There's so many other factors that can come in and say, okay, why did this grove make higher quality fruit and not that grove? Or why is this load of fruit packing so much higher than it did last year? What did we possibly change? So within that line, we try to manage our soils according to the all-brick method. My dad has enjoyed almost a 3 decades relationship with Neil Kinsey, and we've talked with Neil a lot, and he's visited our groves. And so we try to really anchor the farm plan with a calcium magnesium balance, and then work everything off of that, and then add the biological program on top of it, and then as best as you can try to go into labs, and then okay, what was the vitamin C content? Did we see a change in that? That's not actually run and thought of very often. Mm-hmm. And one of the areas that we want to look at into the future is how can we get more of like a mineral, antioxidant, beyond just vitamin C analysis of our juices and of our fruits. And another thing we've branched into is we are into the peel business now, and we found that this citrus peel can be as much as 3 times more nutrient dense than the flesh itself. There's a wonderful book, The Biochemistry and Physiology of the Lemon. It's an old school book out of University of California, decades old, which talks about the nutritional content of the peel. And so there's a lot of to be gained there as well. So, as I look at it, I think our biggest opportunity and what we try to say is, okay, let's start. My dad may have said this earlier. Let's start with a soil analysis, a soil profile, a land analysis of this, the history of this and its current status. Then now let's look at what amendments can we make, and then analyzing the crops that come off of it for their quality, and then maybe even diving deeper into more quality measurements over time in a lab for antioxidants and others, then trying to find, again, what is the common factor there that creates the highest quality fruit. I mean, some people will say, well, it's a soil that supplies excellent amounts of just soluble calcium. You know, calcium is king. That's the foundation of it, as long as it's not in excess. But, you know, that's the first thing to high quality. You know, one of the speakers at Acres talked about that years ago, you know, that, you know, soluble calcium and high quality go right hand in hand. So, you know, that's an area of research that has overlapped with greening, fortunately, because like I said, greening as a circulatory disease of the citrus, it reduces the quality. And that's one of the problems for the symptomatic trees and the symptomatic fruit. So anyway, I hope that answered your question some.
Yeah. And I know you've got to take off here soon, but I just got to say that, you know, we've sat down across the country with many different producers, and Mike said earlier there's definitely a fascination that we don't know citrus at all, but there's a common language across the whole, all the people we talk to, that nutrient dense food, which starts with healthy soil. That's the language we're all talking.
That's the language we're all talking.
Yeah.
You know, my grandfather said something to me that stuck with me. He said he used to like to, when he'd make a point, he'd say, in the final analysis. He'd preface it with that. And I never forget him saying to me several times, and he called me B3 for Ben the Third. And he'd say, B3, in the final analysis, farming, all farming is, it's about taking care of other folks. And if you're not in this to take care of other folks, you don't need to be in farming. He said something, you know, just like that to me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I've enjoyed about, like you said, the organic and sustainable community and the people I've had the great pleasure to interact with. And, you know, we all share that desire to help others and the love of the land. And it's in the conventional farming crowd too. I don't want to say it's only in the organic, sustainable crowd, and because Dad and I came out of the conventional background too. And still cross over into that some. You know, there's people within that community that share the same passion and share the same goals. Mm-hmm. And you know, it certainly doesn't have a boundary in any one label or category. Mm-hmm. But that's the people that we resonate with and enjoy interacting with. And I think that is also the greatest economic opportunity going forward, because, you know, when you get a mass production of anything, there's always low quality that's common, right? And you know, in a world awash with financial liquidity and low interest loans, I mean, it's easy to bring agricultural production in from around the world. But if you pursue nutrient density, you've got a quality barrier there, at least for your product. And that's what we liked with Uncle Matt's. We at least had a chance to be a price maker rather than a price taker. Mm-hmm. Create our brand and tell our story, at least the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I think people miss the boat on with nutrient density is it enhances the health of the plant. It's not just higher quality on the shelf for the consumer, which matters, which makes healthier consumers. And my gosh, with all the health problems in our country, we really need that to be such a focus of our ag community, regardless of what mode of production you're in. But when you turn on the pathways that create nutrient density metabolically within the plant in its final product, you're also turning on the same pathways that give it resilience and disease resistance and cold hardiness and others. So again, that's our great opportunity to, as my granddad said, take care of folks and be profitable along the way. And I just hope, you know, that over time we can get more people involved, and maybe some of our people in the public sector really involved, our scientists and others, universities, more just studying this whole area, nutrient density, resilience, profitability, things like that but goes all the way through to the end consumer, goes all the way through to the health effects in our society as a whole. Mm-hmm. You know, and one of the guys I like listening to a lot is during this is Zach Bush, He's been on John Kemp's podcast as well. Mm-hmm. Zach has been a speaker at Acres and others, and he does a good job. I like listening to him of articulating everything, from the soil to the end user. Mm-hmm. And same with my friend Dr. Arden Anderson. The people that are actually out there taking care of individuals with health issues can tell you how much of it goes back to nutritional issues, which we all know goes back to our soils.
What happened to let thy food be thy medicine?
Absolutely.
I mean, I really think there needs to be a movement back there. And to your point about healthy fruit, well, it's impossible for a plant to give a healthy, nutrient-dense crop if the plant itself isn't healthy. And it's hard for that plant to be healthy if your soil biology isn't healthy. So it starts there and it works through the plant into the fruit. And I love the fact that there's more and more focus on not just volume of production, but let's make it the most nutrient-dense food that we possibly can. And I think within the organic community, I think the lack of research, if you go back into the 90s, the lack of research really got organic farmers to help each other. And that kind of set the trend to where we are today, where if it works for one organic farmer, he wants to tell everybody. It's not a trade secret. And I think with people like John Kemp, who really brought regenerative ag to the forefront, like he's really been pushing that. And John's a good friend of mine. We've had him on. He's great. And I think what you guys are doing here with nutrient density, I think that is the future. And it should be if it isn't.
Yes, because again, it's really tough to be just a commodity producer. Mm-hmm. I mean, the economics of it is challenging. You just have to get bigger and more efficient, and your price is set so much by the futures market, which you obviously have no control over.
Mm-hmm. And as you get bigger and more efficient, you start to lose the connection with the actual trees or the plants or whatever it is that you're working with. You lose that individual connection.
Like Wendell Berry said, we have an eyes to acres problem. It is way out of ratio. And the bigger you get, you don't notice the little things. The observation is gone if you run huge acres.
True, and also you find you just don't have the time even if you want to. And I think you'll find common in the farming community now the frustration that is just kind of residual, sublime amongst all of us in production is that we have to spend so much of our time in regulatory compliance, labor, accounting, paying bills, invoicing, things that matter, but it really consumes a lot of your time and your effort and your energy to be able to go out and just look at your plants and grow your crop and solve all of those problems too. Some days, I mean, it can be overwhelming, and I think it's common amongst farmers and farm producers and farm executives that are managing to basically just feel like I can't manage it all. I'm just doing my best to tread water and get through it. Mm-hmm. And that's something that, again, I don't have all the answers to that, but I'm hoping that long term, this flight to quality and nutrient density and profitability, and hopefully we can have a sea change in the mind of consumers as well too. People like Dan Kittredge, who's also spoken at Acres and works with John Kemp and others that are trying to come up with handheld devices for smartphones and your laser pointers or others that could tell people some basic nutrient density content of your produce. If we could get a sea change within the consumers so more and more of them would just demand this high quality produce, then I think we could obviously drive a lot of profitable production as well too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Some days it just seems so daunting and overwhelming, the whole challenge of it, but at least we've got a challenge and it's something to keep us up. It's a worthy goal to pursue.
Well, and all we can do is what we can on our little piece of land or with our words, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and you're doing that work. And
well, thank you.
I really appreciate it, and you're carrying on what your grandfather said, and thank you so much for the time. This was great.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me.